Our reading this morning is from the book of John, chapter 4, selected verses. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. "He told me everything I have ever done." So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. This is the word of the Lord.
Hey, how are you? Good. Good morning. How are you all? Samaritan woman at high noon. Keep those details in your mind when we enter into the text today. But before we do, I just want to say again how grateful I am to be in Durango. It's been wonderful. Your hospitality has been fantastic. I drove my sons to Denver on Wednesday to drop them off at the airport on Thursday to fly them back home to Kansas City. And I imagine they got there. But before I did that, we had some epic adventures here in and around Durango. We got to hike the Ice Lake Basin outside of Silverton, if you're familiar with that. We floated the Animus, quite a fun time. And then we went up to Purgatory, where we spent the morning riding a mountain roller coaster. Anybody done that? And riding the mountain slide. The luge, I prefer to call it the dry luge, yes? Anybody done that? I learned something. I learned that day that you can take a corner too fast. And I have the battle wounds to prove it, and that is just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. I think hopefully some of you can relate to this. There's this strange phenomenon that happens, at least it's happening to me, when you enter into your mid-40s. I know it's hard to believe. You enter into your mid-40s and you have a child, in my case, a son who is 13. He's nearing 14, and you raise that child from a young boy who is dependent upon you, and you have watched him begin to grow into a young man. And there's this undeniable, unavoidable desire constantly to demonstrate how superior you are to him. You know this, right? Like, you go and play basketball, or you go run with him to show that you're a better runner and a better basketball player. And you do this not because you want to feel sore for the next week, but because you want to demonstrate your superiority. So we rode the luge, and he and his younger brother rode first, and they raced each other. And then we went to ride it again, and it was my turn to race, I told them. And they both said, "Who do you want to race?" And of course, I chose my older son because I wanted to demonstrate my superiority. And I did. For the first third of that race, I did, until I came hurtling down to that curve at rates of speed that nigh threw me over the edge. Fast forward a few moments, and after I had picked up my sled with wheels and cleaned my skin off the track, I made my way down to the bottom, and there I saw my son standing with an attitude that could only be called gloating, yes? You know this. Smiling, laughing, pointing, doing a little dance, and saying things like, "Oh, it is a dark day for you today, oh Dad." And I'll be honest with you, I felt only one emotion. Some of you who are better than me are probably thinking, yes, you were feeling joy over the fact that your son beat you. Not so for me. I was feeling frustrated. Some might call it rage. But that rage was assuaged by the fact that I also felt pain, so my response had to be moderated a little bit. So I adopted a more tempered response. Some call it passive aggressiveness. And I said to him, "Yeah, great job, son. Well done," as I gingerly got out of my sled and said, "Take a look at this. Well done." And when he saw my wounds on my leg, instantly his demeanor changed, right? His demeanor changed. And it went from an understandable sense of victory over to feeling with, right? Feeling with compassion for. He says, "Oh my gosh," his victory no longer mattered. "Are you okay, Dad? Oh my gosh, you must be hurt. Can I help you?" And he did help me. He helped me physically because he helped me with my sled and he helped me down the hill. He also helped me emotionally because when I saw that change in demeanor, so too did my own demeanor. No longer was I defensive. No longer was I crafting ways to show how I won in spite of the fact that I lost. But I accepted it. I felt love for my son. I felt care for my son. I was open to his presence. And as I reflected on that encounter in the days following, I was reminded of two things. Two things struck me. The first is that it reminded me in a funny way what we discussed last Sunday. If you recall, when we contrasted encounter and fracture and relationship. If you remember, in Genesis 2, God is hospitable toward the other so that God might encounter the other. And the result of that is that creativity and life emerges. So God creates space and plays host to the man expressing his disenchantment with the situation. Then God creates space again for the man to participate in the process of resolving the problem. And then God creates space again for the man to rest at the end of that process. And all along the way, creativity and life emerges. By contrast, in Genesis 3, the so-called fall, the man and the woman take possession of the fruit of knowledge on their own terms, in isolation, and immediately try to impose that knowledge upon the other. And the result is that the vulnerability of the individual becomes their shame. They become defensive and they try to hide. The relationship is fractured. Now, I'll let you draw the parallels between that narrative and what will now and forever be called the great dry luge debacle on your own terms. But more pertinent to the text today, the second thing that came to my mind was that too often fractures in relationship are the result of us privileging elements of our own identity at the expense of another, at the exclusion of the other. That is to say, when we place elements of our own identity at the center, there is very little room at times for others to enter. I am a father. I am your father. I should win. And if I don't win, you should understand why. I am a man. My word should be final. I am of this nationality. I know best for you. This is called toxic charity. I hold to this theological idea. I know how you should live your life. I am of this political persuasion. You are not, therefore, your voice has no bearing. You've experienced this. Contrast this with God in Genesis 2. God, who is God, sets aside the divine identity. God claims no superior authority in that process, but interacts in relationship with the man, and thereby creativity results. You follow? Samaritan woman at high noon. If Jesus is God incarnate, as we confess, then we should be able to find instances in which Jesus pursues the type of hospitality that God demonstrated in Genesis 2, that God modeled in Genesis 2. And sure enough, in John 4, as we heard, in John 4, Jesus does this very thing, and identity plays a central role in that process. Or I should say the decentering or the setting aside of identity plays a critical role. Samaritan woman at high noon. Are you familiar with the antagonism between Jews and Samaritans in first century Palestine? It's made popular by the Good Samaritan, Jesus' parable. If you're familiar with it, we may not be as familiar with the background behind it. In 2 Kings, in the Hebrew Bible, chapters 14 to 20, talks about how Samaritans became Samaritans. I'll give you a brief rundown. So you had two kingdoms, right? Israel and Judah. The capital of Israel was in Samaria. The capital of Judah was in Jerusalem. The Jews were in Judah. The rest of the Israelites were in Samaria. 721 BCE, the Assyrians, the great power of the world, marched down to Samaria and they conquered the land. And as is the practice, or as was the practice of the Sumerians, they deported many of the Israelites to other lands and they replaced them with foreigners. Yes? And as often happens, the Israelites who remained in the land mixed with the deportees from other lands. And from the perspective of the Jews in the south and Judea and Jerusalem, this had two really problematic consequences. The first is that their bloodline was altered. Their ethnicity was changed. And the second was that the mixing of religion caused problems with the Israelite religion, or the religion of the Samaritans. You follow that? We see this as the woman discusses proper worship with Jesus in their encounter. This is who Jesus encountered at the well, the Samaritan and the woman. This is a problem. A man in first century Palestine, especially a male leader, has no place engaging with a woman, especially a woman who is alone. If you read the text on your own, later on in the text, when the disciples return to Jesus after buying food, they themselves say, "Jesus, what are you doing? You shouldn't be talking to this woman, much less this Samaritan woman whose ethnicity and whose religion is defiled." You follow? You should not be with this woman. And the author of the text emphasizes the fact that they are having this encounter at high noon. Why does the author say this? As many people have pointed out, individuals, women in particular, would not be gathering water or collecting water at high noon in the heat of the day. Rather, women would go to the well to collect water at dawn and at dusk in the cool of the day. Moreover, women would not do this alone because of the dangers involved. What does this say about this woman? She's an outcast. Her community of women who would go and collect water together at dawn and at dusk were not including her. And it is likely because of her lifestyle. Again, in the dialogue between Jesus and the other, as it unfolds, he points out in their conversation that she's living a lifestyle that is not accepted by her community. Follow this? The Samaritan woman at high noon, a woman of ill repute. 4 reasons for Jesus to avoid this conversation. 4 reasons for Jesus not to make space for the others. Jesus is a Jew. Jesus worships in Jerusalem. Jesus is a male leader, and he should, as such, only be pursuing the relationship with those who are pure ethically. But Jesus sets aside his identity. He subverts expectations of the reader. And he subverts expectations of our contemporary culture. He subverts the practice of our contemporary culture by being present with this woman, in spite of their conflicting identities. And they have a wonderful conversation. They talk about her past, her lifestyle, without judgment. They talk about their different religious practices, and near the end he concludes, but there is a day coming in spite of our differences that we will worship neither here nor there, but together in spirit, together in spirit. And at the end, it is revealed that he is the Messiah come. And the woman embraces this revelation. The Messiah come, the part of the good news of Jesus, part of the gospel of Jesus' ministry. And what is so subversive is that the story doesn't end there, but she picks up this revelation that she learned from their conversation. And she goes to her people, for whom she was an outcast, and she preaches the good news of Messiah come. She, the Samaritan woman of ill repute, preaches the gospel of Messiah come for the first time in the gospel of John. This is what happens when we decenter ourselves and we make space for the other. So I pushed quickly through the text, and I encourage you to read it on your own. But I pushed quickly through it because I want to share with you an opportunity I had to bear witness to the wisdom of Jesus in John 4 and the hospitality of God in Genesis 2. At the end of June, I was privileged to take part in a small conference that consisted of myself and about 20 other professors at small liberal arts colleges, and we were wrestling together with what it would look like to engage in higher levels of interfaith and interreligious dialogue on our campus. And this conference was hosted by Interfaith America and led by Interfaith America. And one of the primary leaders was a man called Ibu Patel. He was the founder of Interfaith America, is the founder of Interfaith America. And he has skin in the game. He is of Indian descent. He is a Muslim, a practicing Muslim. He is a Shiite Muslim, which is the minority of the 2 major Muslim groups. You have the Sunni, which is the majority, and the Shiite. And within that Shiite category, he is also an Ismaili Muslim, which is a minority within the Shiite community. So he is a minority within a minority. And he is a Muslim in America. And his experience with that is what encouraged him to foster interfaith dialogue, to find commonality in spite of our differences, so that we can work together to pursue the good life, to pursue a life of flourish. So he tells a story. And in this story, he embodies the wisdom of Jesus. And we in the conference are listening. And it's a case study. So he says, as the founder of Interfaith America, I was asked several years ago to present to a group of high school students at a larger conference, a larger interfaith conference in Toronto. And all they told me was that there's going to be about 200 to 300 students present. Do your thing. And so Ibu Patel thinks about it and he decides these are probably going to be students who are from the local public high schools. So I'm going to just talk to them about my own experience as an Ismaili Shiite Muslim in America, right? And then he gathered a panel of students that he had worked with and asked them to talk about their own experience and their own identity in the world of religion and interfaith dialogue. Follow? Sounds good. So he gets to the venue early, and he enters into the auditorium, and he is shocked to see about 250 high school students who are all in uniform, sitting up straight, completely silent, segregated by gender. And at that moment, he knows he is not dealing with public school students from Toronto. He has been visited by students from the Jewish high school and students from the Muslim high school. And immediately he starts thinking, I need to rethink what I'm going to say to them. And so he goes to the members of his panel who have not seen the individuals that they will be addressing, and he asks, and he tells them what's going on, and he says, we may need to rethink what we're going to say. So will you give me a brief rundown or your opening pitch of what you are planning on presenting? And the first individual says, I was going to say that I am a black, queer pagan who cannot worship a white god of oppression. Full stop. He turns to us now, the members of the conference, and he says to us, what would you do? What would you do? Some of my colleagues said, that's a critical part of this individual's identity. They should be able to express it. You follow? They should be able to express it regardless of the context in which they find themselves. And Ibu Patel, he listened. And then with this measured, thoughtful sense of wisdom, he responded, the type of wisdom I wish I had. And he responded with a bit of a pushback. He said, I'm Muslim. I know Muslim headmasters. I know Muslim teachers. I know Muslim students. I know Muslim parents. And aside from everything else, the first mention of pagan is going to turn people off. Because Islam formed out of and in response to paganism. In response to paganism. And he says, if that's allowed to be said, if that is said, the work that we have done to encourage interfaith dialogue, to encourage communication and relationship may be lost. And he says, I agree that those things are an important part of this individual's identity, but they cannot be expressed. They cannot be expressed at the expense of relationship. And he goes on to say, I'm Ismaili. I'm Shiite. And when I begin interacting with some of my Muslim brothers and sisters for the first time, I do not disclose those important parts of my identity because I know that some of my Muslim brothers and sisters will not consider me Muslim, and therefore the capacity to dialogue, the capacity to form relationships will fall apart. So I hide that. And it may be years later that I revealed that, but the relationship is fostered first. You follow? This is the wisdom of a man who's modeling the wisdom of Jesus and the hospitality of God in our own sacred tradition. And here's the challenge for us then. When are we wise enough to set our identity aside to make space for other people? Do you follow? And let me be clear, identity is important. As a father, I have responsibilities that I must pursue. As I tell my children, I am not your friend. I am your father. Hopefully one day we can be friends. Identity is important, but when does it get in the way of relationship? Too often, I think in our contemporary society, in our culture, our desire to privilege and promote our identity at the expense of others decreases our capacity to relate. So I ask that we pursue the path of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at high noon. Will you pray with me? God, we ask you to, again, give us the courage and the wisdom to know when it is that we must set ourselves aside, that we must decenter ourselves so that we might make space and be hospitable toward those with whom we are attempting to foster relationship, so that your presence may be greater on the earth. Amen.